Amidst the vast expanse of the Baltic Sea, nestled among thousands of islands, lies the town of Mariehamn. This charming town is a blend of Finnish and Swedish cultures, but beyond the town lies the enigmatic Åland Islands, officially a part of Finland, yet with their own distinct culture, laws, and Swedish-speaking people. Surprisingly, despite their strategic location and a history of being militarized and demilitarized, the islands remain defenseless, a fact that seems strange in the current world of reignited Cold War tensions, as the islands, just some 400 kilometers off the Russian mainland, have immense strategic value for the domination of the Baltic Sea. How has this come to be? And should they be remilitarized once more? Furthermore, what is the story behind their Swedish roots, making them a site of one of the most successful political compromises in the modern world? Let's roll. The Åland Islands are actually comprised of some 6,700 different islands scattered across the Baltic Sea. But 90% of the population reside on Fasta Island, separated from Sweden by just 38 kilometers of open water to the west. In the east, the Åland archipelago is contiguous with the Finnish archipelago. As such, the islands are geographically a continuation of Finland. The islands act as the central choke point between the northern Gulf of Bothnia and the rest of the southern Baltic Sea, while historically they were a bridge between Sweden and Finland. It was thanks to this close proximity of the Åland Islands to Sweden that Swedes would begin to migrate to them, until the islands became officially a part of Sweden during the 12th century. It was through the Åland Islands that the Christian Swedish kingdom would settle the pagan Finnish lands to their east. And during the many wars of the militaristic Swedish Empire, the Åland Islands acted as an important stopping point for Swedish naval vessels on their way eastwards. Simultaneously, they acted as a bridge that would allow the Russians to threaten the Swedish capital of Stockholm in 1809 during the Finnish War. After the upcoming Swedish defeat, it was forced to cede Finland and Åland to Russia, after which Finland would be made into an autonomous Grand Duchy within the Russian Empire. During the Crimean War, the Åland Islands experienced the war firsthand as the combined Franco-British force of warships and marines occupied the islands and destroyed the Russian fortress of Bomarsund. In the peace treaty which ended the Crimean War in 1856, one of the requirements for peace was the demilitarization of Åland Islands, which Russia accepted. The First World War would see the islands become the site of the naval battle of the Åland Islands, where Russian and German fleets clashed with each other in 1915. And shortly afterwards, when Russia collapsed into civil war in 1917, the autonomous Grand Duchy of Finland declared independence. And with this, the status of the Åland Islands became an area of conflict between Sweden and the newly independent nation of Finland. The people of the Åland Islands worked towards getting incorporated into Sweden, for which they would hold a referendum regarding the matter of being annexed in 1919. The referendum saw over 95% of the islanders vote in favor of annexation, but the Finnish government would only accept to give the islands autonomy instead. During the Finnish Civil War of 1918, the islands would be occupied by a Swedish peacekeeping force, before they gave way to the Germans, who had been invited by the conservative white government of Finland to occupy the islands. After the German surrender and the end of the Finnish Civil War, with the communist forces defeated, the Finnish government would reinstate control over the islands and would only accept giving them autonomy, despite the clear desire of the local population to join Sweden. In 1921, the dispute over the status of the Åland Islands was handed over to the newly formed League of Nations, which would rule in favor of Finland. This meant that the islands would remain part of Finland, but as an autonomous region, which was to additionally remain demilitarized. The demilitarized status of the islands would be respected during the Second World War, with the islands' merchant shipping being largely spared by the combatants of the war. From the end of the Second World War to today, the Åland Islands have enjoyed an unprecedented amount of autonomy and remain demilitarized. However, as tensions on the Baltic heat up, with Finnish entry into NATO being just a matter of time, it remains to be seen whether the status of the Åland Islands will need to be revisited. So what exactly makes the Åland Islands and their status extraordinary? Well, when the Åland Islands became an autonomous region of Finland in 1922, it was a truly unique and almost never before seen case of a nation granting one of its directly controlled regions an extensive amount of political autonomy. While Great Britain had granted great amounts of political autonomy to its colonies, for example Canada, they were distant colonies and not exactly integral parts of Great Britain. Similarly, the Soviet Union around the same time saw itself organized under a union of Soviet Socialist republics. But the Russian Republic dominated the rest of the republics, more as colonies. There were other governments with a more decentralized system of government, like the federal United States. However, none of them had a minority population granted special rights, like the Swedish-speaking population was given in the Finnish Åland Islands. Sweden's claim to the islands was based on nationalism, which means the idea of people of the same ethnicity or culture having the right to their own country, while Finland's claim to the islands was based on the legality of ownership, because the Åland Islands had been legally part of the Grand Duchy of Finland ever since the Finnish War. Based on this, Finland claimed legal ownership over the islands. Then there's also the fact that the archipelago is geographically a continuation of Finland's coast. This helped convince the Japanese delegation in particular, as this furthered Japan's goals of controlling Pacific islands. Then there's also the fact that if Sweden were to control the islands, they would have the ability to severely disrupt naval traffic going to and from Turku. The final decision of the League of Nations was that the Åland Islands would be owned by Finland, while in turn they would be demilitarized, and the islands would be granted political and cultural autonomy. This made perfect sense. Firstly, the Swedish claim in regards to the islands' culturally Swedish population was addressed, with Finland being obliged to ensure the cultural autonomy of the islands, which would include Swedish being the island's only official language. The military aspect was addressed also, with the demilitarization of the islands, which meant that any direct security concerns in regards to the islands being owned by Finland would not be a problem to Sweden, as no military forces could be stationed on the islands. Lastly, the legality aspect used by Finland to claim the islands was addressed by the island being granted to Finland. The success of this compromise can be best seen in a survey done in 2020, in which 78% of respondents preferred the current autonomous status, with no great difference between demographics, while only 9% supported joining Sweden. Despite the cultural and language differences between the Åland Islands and the rest of Finland, a clear majority of the island's inhabitants prefer the status quo, remaining with Finland. But even with the best decisions and compromises, there will always be problems, because there's no such thing as a flawless decision. Despite the fact that Finland is obliged to protect the islands in the case that their demilitarization is violated by a hostile power, the islands could be in theory seized by the numerically superior Russian Baltic Fleet. And Finland, not yet being a NATO member, would mean that the rest of Europe would be quite powerless to respond to its violation of territorial integrity, due to the Article 5 not applying to Finland yet. However, this was more of a theoretical possibility before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. With Finland's imminent entry into NATO and the decisive Western response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine means that this theoretical scenario has become far less possible. So despite the geopolitical tensions around Russia, the Åland Islands are set to remain demilitarized. Not to mention that the Finnish border guard, which operates from stations in Mariehamn and Kokar, in case of a crisis could be transferred from the Interior Ministry to the Defense Ministry, thus becoming part of the military. And so the Åland Islands are set to remain independent, mostly Swedish-speaking, and a demilitarized part of Finland. Now check out my video on Vyborg. It's a Russian city which was once one of the most vibrant places in Finland. And this is my Patreon up. Thank you all for your continued support. And many thanks to Aelheim for helping me research and write this video. GeoPerspective out.